9 people, 1 tent. And a question that has outlived every person who could have answered it. When a search party finally reached this slope in the last week of February 1959, they found the tent standing exactly where it had been pitched. Inside, nothing was missing. Boots in a row. Coats folded. A stove unlit. Bread sliced and waiting. And a long tear down one wall of the canvas, cut, not ripped, from the inside, facing out. 9 experienced winter mountaineers, in temperatures that kill an undressed person in under an hour, chose to destroy their own shelter rather than use its functioning door. That single decision is the hinge this entire case turns on. Every theory, avalanche, military accident, infrasound, something with no name at all, has to explain why disciplined, trained people did the one thing that should never make sense. They left the warmth, and they left it fast. This is a story about what really happened to them, rebuilt not from folklore, but from terrain data, wind physics, and forensic pathology. Some of it will surprise people who think this case was closed years ago. Some of it will surprise people who think it can never be closed at all. To understand why they were on that slope at all, you have to understand what they were trying to prove. In January of 1959, 10 students and recent graduates, most from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, set out to earn something called a Grade 3 hiking certification, the highest classification the Soviet Sporting Authority awarded. It wasn't a casual badge. Candidates designed their own route, one difficult enough to be approved by a review board, and then they had to survive it, in winter, largely on their own judgment. Leading them was Igor Dyatlov, 23, an engineering student known for building his own equipment rather than trusting factory gear. The group of 9 men and 2 women included a decorated World War II veteran, several seasoned ski tours, and friends who had hiked together before. This was not a group of amateurs improvising in the wilderness. On paper, they were exactly the kind of people who should have come home. Their diaries, recovered later from the tent and from film left in their cameras, read like the diaries of any group of friends on a long trip. Complaints about cold feet. In-jokes about who forgot what. A handwritten camp newspaper they wrote for their own amusement, mocking each other's snoring and stove technique. Nothing in these pages hints at fear. If anything, the opposite. These are the words of people enjoying themselves. On January 28th, one member of the original 10, a young man named Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back. An old joint condition had flared badly enough that continuing was impossible. He said goodbye to his friends on the trail, watched them disappear into the white, and turned toward home. He would spend the rest of his life as the only member of that expedition who came home. Decades later, when journalists asked him what he thought had happened on the mountain, he gave an answer that has stayed with almost everyone who studies this case. He said he didn't want to know the details anymore, because every theory he heard felt like losing his friends a second time. Yudin never remarried, kept photographs of the group in his home for the rest of his life, and is buried, by his own request, beside them. That's the human cost sitting underneath every technical detail we're about to walk through. 9 names, 9 futures, and one man who carried the question for 60 years. By January 31st, the remaining 9 had reached the edge of a forested valley and begun their push toward the pass. The next day, February 1st, they made a decision investigators would debate for 6 decades. Standard mountaineering practice says, camp low, in the trees, where wind is broken and firewood is close. Instead, the group pitched their single tent on the open eastern shoulder of a mountain the local Mansi people called Kholat Sayachal, a name that translates, roughly, to Dead Mountain, a name that existed centuries before this expedition and had nothing to do with them. Why camp there? The most likely answer is tactical, not reckless. They had already lost time and elevation earlier that day after a navigation error, and pitching camp on the open slope meant they wouldn't have to reclimb it the next morning. It was a reasonable trade-off made by tired, competent people at the end of a long day. They cut a flat shelf into the snow to level their tent floor, laid their skis flat underneath as insulation against the ground, ate dinner, and got into their sleeping bags. No one recorded hearing anything unusual that evening. But the choice to cut into that slope, to slice a shelf out of a snowpack that had been building for weeks under shifting winds, is the detail that would matter more than anyone in that tent could have known. Something happened that night that gave 9 trained mountaineers a reason to believe staying inside was more dangerous than temperatures of -25 to -30 degrees Celsius, in the dark, without their boots. They didn't use the tent's functioning entrance. They cut a new exit through the fabric wall and climbed out through it. That alone tells us something concrete. Whatever the danger was, the entrance, likely on the downhill, buried side of the tent, was not a viable way out fast enough. Cutting a second exit is not panic. It's a fast, deliberate engineering decision made by people who understood their equipment. Search teams later counted 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent, down the slope, toward the tree line roughly 1.5 miles away. Investigators at the time, and every documentary since, have fixated on one detail: the tracks were orderly, not scattered, not doubling back. A loose but steady line, moving together, down toward the forest. This detail is usually presented as proof that whatever chased them out of the tent wasn't immediately life-threatening, because people running from mortal danger don't walk in formation. That's a fair read. But it's also consistent with something more specific, a group that had just heard or felt something the mountain does before it fails. Experienced backcountry travelers are trained to recognize a particular warning sign in wind-packed snow, a dull, muffled collapsing sound underfoot, sometimes called a humph. That means a weak layer beneath the surface has just given way somewhere nearby. It doesn't mean you're already buried. It means the slope you're standing on has just told you it might not hold, and the only correct response is to get off it immediately, calmly, and without wasting time on boots. That single mechanism would explain almost everything about this stage of the night. Trained mountaineers, hearing or feeling the mountain shift beneath a tent they had just cut into the slope, would not have needed to be struck to know they had to leave immediately. And they would have left in the disciplined, moving together way search teams found. No injuries yet. No struggle. Just urgency without panic, from people who understood exactly what that sound meant and had no intention of finding out what came next. About 1.5 miles down the slope, the footprints reached the tree line and stopped being visible under drifting snow. It's here, at the base of a large cedar, that the first bodies were found. 2 of the youngest men in the group, dressed in only their underwear, were found here beside the ashes of a small fire. Above them, branches had been snapped off the trunk up to a height no one could reach standing on the ground, meaning someone had climbed, in bare feet, in the dark, in extreme cold, and torn at the wood hard enough to leave skin behind on the bark. That detail is not evidence of frenzy, it's evidence of function. Climbing that tree gives you 2 things: a vantage point back toward the tent, to check whether it's safe to return, and dry, elevated branches for a fire that green ground wood can't provide. Someone climbed that tree doing a job, assessing the slope and gathering fuel, while the group below tried to keep 2 badly cold, underdressed friends alive next to a fire too weak to do much more than smolder. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more members of the group were found at intervals, all of them facing back toward the tent, all of them further along than the last. Igor Dyatlov himself was among them. The read here is straightforward and, frankly, admirable. Once it became clear the fire wasn't enough, the strongest 3 attempted to climb back up through deep snow and brutal wind to reach the tent, retrieve boots, warm clothing, and equipment, and bring it back down to the others. One by one, exhaustion and cold overtook them, each a little closer to the tent than the one before. A visible record of exactly how far 3 determined, freezing people could push their bodies before their bodies simply stopped answering. None of the 5 found at this stage. The 2 at the cedar, the 3 on the open slope, show the catastrophic internal injuries that would later define this case. Their deaths, by every medical account, were caused by hypothermia and exposure. Whatever ultimately broke ribs and fractured skulls in this story had not yet happened to anyone. The remaining 4 hikers weren't found for another 3 months. Search teams spent the rest of the winter probing drifts with metal rods and finding nothing. It wasn't until May, when melting snow finally exposed the terrain, that searchers located them in a ravine roughly 75 meters past the cedar tree, under close to 4 meters of packed snow, at the bottom of a small frozen stream. These 4 had done something the others hadn't. They had built a shelter. A rough pit or den, dug into the snow above the stream, using the terrain itself as a windbreak. A legitimate, textbook survival technique when a fire isn't sustainable and the wind is lethal. They were also, notably, dressed differently, wearing clothing that had been cut from the bodies of the 2 men found at the cedar. Once it was clear those 2 could no longer be helped, the living had made the grim, rational choice to take what warmth remained and redistribute it to whoever still had a chance. The medical findings from these 4 are what turned this from a tragic accident into 60 years of speculation. 2 of them had massive chest fractures, multiple ribs broken and driven inward, comparable in force to a high-speed vehicle collision. 1 had a fractured skull. And in every case, the skin above these injuries was undamaged. No cuts. No bruising consistent with a direct blow. Soviet pathologists at the time described the force required as being beyond anything a human being could inflict, and said so on the record. That pattern, severe internal trauma with no external wound, is the signature of massive, evenly distributed pressure, not a blow, It's the kind of injury produced when a heavy, rigid mass presses down on a body that's lying on an equally rigid surface underneath, so the force has nowhere to escape except through the body itself. Skis, laid flat as ground insulation, would have made a hard floor. Something heavy, cold, and unyielding pressing down from above would have made the anvil complete. There's one more detail that has fueled Cold War-era conspiracy theories for 6 decades. Trace levels of radiation on some of the clothing recovered from this group. It sounds sinister in isolation. It's considerably less so in context. Records that surfaced after the fall of the Soviet Union show that at least one member of this final group had previously worked at a facility involved in the cleanup of a serious nuclear accident the year before the expedition. Contamination carried, unknowingly, on clothing from an entirely unrelated job, not evidence of anything happening on the mountain that night. As for the missing soft tissue noted in the most severely affected body, tissue loss around the eyes and mouth, the far more mundane explanation, consistent with basic forensic pathology, is that a body submerged in flowing meltwater for 3 months loses its most delicate tissue first to decomposition and small aquatic organisms. It's an upsetting detail. It is not an unexplainable one. The official Soviet investigation lasted roughly 3 months. It closed in May of 1959 with a cause of death recorded as a compelling unknown force, a phrase that answered nothing and explained less. The files were sealed. The mountain pass was closed to civilian hikers for the next 3 years. No avalanche was named, no storm, no accident of any kind, just an unnamed force and silence. Into that silence poured 60 years of theories, secret weapons testing, escaped prisoners from nearby labor camps, infrasound generated by wind over the mountain's dome shape, said to trigger irrational panic. Reports, real, documented, but never conclusively linked, of strange lights seen by other travelers in the region that same winter. Every one of these theories has at least one detail working in its favor, and every single one collides, eventually, with a piece of evidence it can't explain. There were no other footprints in the snow, ruling out an attack by another person or group. There was no blast crater, no scorching, no debris field of any kind, ruling out an explosion. There was no predator track, no defensive wounds, ruling out an animal. Whatever this was, it left no signature except its effect on 9 people and the tent they abandoned. The most credible scientific breakthrough came in 2019 and 2021, when Russian authorities reopened the case and 2 European researchers, a geotechnical engineer and a snow avalanche specialist, modeled the slope using terrain data, historical wind records, and biomechanical crash test data originally developed for vehicle safety testing and, separately, for snow simulation animation techniques. Their published work demonstrated something the original investigators never tested: that the slope, despite looking too shallow and too undisturbed for a classic avalanche, was steep enough. Once you accounted for the shelf, the hikers themselves had cut into it to release a small, dense slab of wind-packed snow hours after the cut was made. Once accumulating wind-blown snow finally overloaded the weak layer beneath it. That published research solved the biggest scientific objection to the avalanche theory. It explained how a slope that looked too gentle, with no visible debris field, could still fail catastrophically, and why it would take hours rather than minutes to do so. Here's the part almost every version of this story glosses over, and it's worth sitting with directly. If a slab of dense, heavy snow struck that tent hard enough to crush ribs and fracture a skull, the people inside it should have shown exactly those injuries. Immediately, at the tent, before anyone went anywhere. Instead, the 5 who died first, at the cedar and on the open slope, show only hypothermia. No fractures. No internal trauma. They were cold, exhausted, and eventually overwhelmed. But they were not crushed. And they were mobile enough to organize a fire, climb a tree, and mount an attempt to climb back uphill for supplies. That's not consistent with people who had just survived being struck by a slab heavy enough to break bone without breaking skin. The catastrophic injuries appear only in the 4 found in the ravine. At the one location in this entire story where we know, independently, that a structure built from snow existed above people lying beneath it, for months, under a slope that continued to accumulate wind-driven load throughout that same storm system. Put those 2 facts together, and a different sequence becomes available. One that uses the same avalanche mechanics established by the published research, but relocates the moment of catastrophic force from the tent to the ravine hours later. The same wind system loading a weak layer above the tent that night did not stop working once the group moved downhill. It kept transporting snow, kept adding weight, across the same slope for the same number of hours. A den dug into a snowbank above a running creek. hollowed out from below, loaded from above by the same wind, is a structurally weaker version of exactly the same trap the group had unknowingly built above their own tent a few hours earlier. When that roof gave way, the 4 people beneath it took the full, evenly distributed weight of a collapsing snowmass directly onto their chests and skulls, pinned against the frozen, unyielding ground of the creek bed beneath them. The same physics the published avalanche model describes, arriving hours later at a different location, for reasons that had nothing to do with the tent at all. This isn't offered as a settled fact. No one who was there survived to confirm it, and the physical evidence that could prove it beyond doubt was scattered, buried, or lost to 3 months of Ural winter before anyone found it. What it offers is something more modest and, in its way, more honest. A single, continuous mechanism. Wind-loaded snow failing under its own accumulating weight. That accounts for every stage of this night without requiring 2 separate unexplained events, and without requiring anything from outside the laws of physics. Strip away 6 decades of orange lights, secret weapons, and things with no name, and what's left is smaller and, somehow, harder to sit with. 9 people did almost everything right. They read a warning sign in the snow correctly and left fast enough to save themselves from an immediate danger. They kept moving as a unit. They built a fire. They made the unbearable decision to take clothing from friends who could no longer use it in order to keep the rest of the group alive a little longer. 3 of them turned back into a killing wind, not away from it, to try to save the others. And in the end, the same slope that let them walk away once found them again, in a place they had every reason to believe was safe. There was no predator on that mountain, no weapon, no force with intent. There was wind, snow, and the quiet arithmetic of a slope that had been failing since the moment someone cut a flat shelf into it. And 9 people who did not know they had built their own trap, twice, in the same night. Whether every detail of this reconstruction will ever be proven is a fair question, and an honest answer is, probably not. The mountain doesn't keep records, and the only people who could confirm the sequence minute by minute didn't survive it. What can be said is that this version accounts for the calm at the tent, the fire at the cedar, the climb back uphill, and the crush injuries in the ravine, all 4 stages of that night, using one continuous physical process, rather than treating each as its own separate mystery. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the physics really does explain every wound, every footprint, and every hour of that night, does that make this case feel finished to you? Or does an ordinary physical explanation for something this devastating leave you more unsettled than any theory involving something unexplainable ever could? Tell me which version stays with you longer.